Mobilizing for World War II really transformed the role of the national government in much the same way that it did with World War I, but on a different level this time. Many agencies, just like Woodrow Wilson created a number of agencies during World War I, FDR created a number of agencies during World War II to regulate labor, shipping, created manufacturing quotas, fixed wages, prices, even rent. Through the creation of these new agencies, over 3 million new federal jobs were created. Unemployment went from 14% down to 2% within 2 years. Any manufacturing that currently existed, so like factories that maybe it was a factory that made toasters, those factories were then kind of retooled to produce things for wartime production. So you can see in the picture on this slide, this would have been a car factory in Detroit that was then retooled to be able to create tanks for the war effort. In addition to this, the federal government sold war bonds, which were like loans that you could pay to the government and you could get your money back in like 50 years. They also increased taxes and withheld more income tax from people. The federal government also offered incentives to manufacturers to spur production. So they offered like low interest loans, tax concessions. Many businesses received government contracts to build things that the government needed. The bulk of federal spending, though, did end up going to the largest corporations. Those were the ones who got most of the government contracts and the loans and tax concessions. But you know, it really was impressive the amount of manufacturing that was able to be switched over to the war. In addition to manufacturing, the government also sponsored scientific research. So things like radar, jet engines, early computers were all created through scientific research that was being done, funded by the government in order to help the war effort. What this did have the impact of doing was reinvigorating older manufacturing centers, and it also created some new manufacturing centers. Really, the West Coast exploded with manufacturing, and it really emerged as like the focus of military production. And part of the reason for that was because of all of the millions of migrants that had gone to California in the midst of the Dust Bowl. So you have a willing and able workforce on the West Coast, specifically in California. As with all wartime, and I mentioned this at one point when we were talking about World War I, the government is always very supportive of unions in times of war. And in the midst of World War II, there was a three-sided agreement between labor, government, and business that allowed for union membership to rise to unprecedented levels. The amount of people that joined unions in the midst of the war was unprecedented for any other point in time. The government forced union recognition on businesses. In the midst of the New Deal, Roosevelt was trying to give concessions to unions and trying to get businesses to support and recognize unions, but a lot of times businesses would just ignore, and the federal government really couldn't do anything about that. But as soon as we are involved in the war, the government was using its power to force businesses to recognize and deal with unions. Union leaders, for their part, agreed that they would not go on strike, which was really important because we needed this workforce, and conceded that the employer had the right to managerial prerogatives, fair profits. So they were giving some concessions of their own. There were some, in the midst of the war, some brief walkouts where workers would be protesting the speed of production and the disparity between frozen wages and expanding corporate profits. But these were often short-lived and often ended with workers receiving more of what they were wanting. The idea of freedom was something that pervaded wartime America, especially when we are talking about propaganda. As we know, within World War II, the government organized the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, to really mobilize public opinion and shape the message of the war, like why we are fighting. And certainly we had the same thing during World War II. FDR's version of the CPI was the Office of War Information. And they really, that federal agency really focused on the entire scope of the war, right? So we get into the war because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So certainly Japanese retribution is a war aim that we are dealing with. But FDR knows that we will not just be fighting the Japanese. We will also be fighting in Europe, which did nothing to us, right? Like Nazi Germany, as much of a threat as it was never an aggressor towards the United States. And so that focusing on the entire scope of the war was a really important job of the Office of War Information. And all of the information that kind of comes out of the Office of War Information is focused on the 4 freedoms. And this is what FDR kind of said the war was about. The war was about preserving 4 freedoms, and that was freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And so most of the propaganda that comes out is focused on those 4 freedoms. The Office of War Information used the radio, they used film, they used the press to push this ideological meaning of the war. And because it was using this idea of freedoms, it's drawing on really deep-seated American traditions of liberty and freedom. Now, there was kind of like a silent 5th freedom as well, which was freedom of enterprise, right? And that's kind of the capitalistic or business side of American freedom. And in wartime advertising, often the government would use brand names in that wartime advertising and then relate the use of those brand names to the war. We also see unprecedented levels of woman power that is being used in the war, not only to fill industrial jobs, like we all understand Rosie the Riveter. So women were working in many jobs, but there was also new opportunities, not just in industrial employment, but also professional employment, government employment. The government actually forced unions to accept women and deal with issues that impacted women personally, like equal pay, maternity leave, childcare. After the war is over, many women want to stay working, but their work was not seen in that light. To the government, women working in the midst of the war was a wartime solution to a labor shortage, not something that was supposed to be permanent. It's supposed to be temporary. The war aims, part of like that freedom of speech, worship, from want, from fear, really was all about creating the world of tomorrow, right? Like what the world is going to look like after we conquer these freedoms and we push out all of the people that are trying to restrict these freedoms, like the Japanese, like the Germans. And that world of tomorrow was ultimately going to be centered on a return to a family-centered prosperity, which really meant that women would need to go back to the home and be focused on working in the home, raising children. And we'll get into more of that next week when we talk about the Cold War.